Welcome, everyone. My name is Kristen Reid, and I am a research coordinator here at Health Evidence. We are very pleased that you're able to join us today to talk about the effectiveness of behavioral interventions to reduce the intake of sugar-sweetened beverages in children and adolescents. So in a few moments, I will be introducing our authors of this paper who have joined us today and who we are very thrilled to have share their work in this area. So we would also like to take this time to wish a warm welcome to our presenters and also to welcome all of our health evidence users that have joined us for the webinar today. So throughout the session today, we will be posting polling questions through the WebEx platform. Your participation in these polling questions is voluntary and anonymous. I'll leave this consent slide up for a moment just to give you a chance to review and then move on shortly. All right, so just to let everyone know that after today, the PowerPoint presentation and the audio recording will be made available on Health Evidence's YouTube and SlideShare accounts, usually within the next week or so. And the links to both of these resources will be posted in the chat section now for you to access. So today we are very excited to be talking about the review Effectiveness of Behavioral Interventions to Reduce the Intake of Sugar-Sweetened Beverages in Children and Adolescents, a systematic review and meta-analysis. The link to the Health Evidence Review page for this systematic review will be posted in the chat section. You can click on the link and follow along in the review using the article full text or PubMed link out on the record page. And I believe Kate has also shared the direct link to the full text article for you as well. So just a few more housekeeping items before we begin. Please use the chat section in WebEx to post your questions and comments. We ask that you send your questions or comments to all participants and not just to the host, as many others may have similar questions to you. Also, we really encourage you to post your questions and comments as they come to mind throughout the session. Towards the end of the session, we will save some time for the authors to respond to anything that comes to mind. For the best connection, we recommend that you use a wired internet connection versus a wireless connection. And should you have any connection issues, we have posted the 24/7 WebEx helpline on this slide, as well as in this chat section. For your audio today, we ask that you please listen through your speakers. If you are having trouble hearing, you can go to Communicate at the top bar in WebEx and then click on Integrated Voice Conference and Join Conference. So we have our first polling question of the day, which can be found on the right-hand side of the WebEx platform. And this is just to get a sense, really, of how many people are joining us for today's webinar. So are you joining just with yourself? Are you in a small group of 2 to 3 or 4 to 5? Or are you joining today as a larger group of 6 to 10 or perhaps even over 10 people? All right, thank you. So this is also just a reminder to please make sure to press submit at the bottom after you've selected your response so that it can be recorded. Wonderful, thank you. So as I see them coming in, it seems that most people are joining by themselves today. However, we do have a couple medium and larger groups. So that's really great to see. Thank you. We'd also like to give a special thanks to our health evidence team who have worked to bring this session to you today. There is a small team of us who work to keep health evidence current and maintained, as well as to coordinate our monthly webinar series. For those of you who may not be familiar, Health Evidence is a service and research organization involved in knowledge translation for public health professionals that was launched in 2005. Our main product is a comprehensive registry of reviews where we provide over 5,000 quality-rated systematic reviews evaluating the effectiveness of public health and health promotion interventions. The main goals of health evidence are to make evidence relevant to public health more accessible and to make it easier for professionals to use evidence in their decision making. So the value add really of using health evidence is that we save you time. We've done the work to screen and appraise each review within our registry. We screen all reviews for relevance to public health and keep our repository up to date by constantly screening relevant databases. At any given time, we are no more than 1 to 2 months behind the publication date. So we have done the work for you by critically appraising all reviews through a transparent process whereby you can actually click on the full quality assessment for each review and see our rating for each of our 10 assessment criteria. The Health Evidence website also has various tools and supports for evidence-informed decision-making available online, and these, as well as our repository, are designed to be both easy and simple to use. So I'm just going to take a brief moment to quickly touch on the model for evidence-informed decision-making to help ground our presentation today, and which we can also hopefully keep in mind as the presenter goes through this systematic review. This model consists of 5 components that you can see in this diagram. Public health practitioners and decision makers need to consider evidence from a variety of sources, including community health issues in local context, existing resources, community and political climate, in making decisions about programs and policies, and research evidence. The Health Evidence webinar series is designed to highlight findings from research evidence relevant to public health decisions. And on this next slide, we can see the stages of evidence-informed public health that really illustrate the steps involved in evidence-informed practice. So this wheel is a guide for practitioners and decision makers to determine how to address a particular issue by systematically incorporating evidence into the decision-making process. So we have our next polling question here, and we're wondering how many participants here today have heard of or are familiar with the term PICOS. So thank you for all of your responses coming in. That's wonderful. And it seems like the majority of people have heard of this before. However, there are several who are less familiar with the term. So for those of you who are not familiar, PICOS is a way for you to structure your research questions. And it involves defining who the population is that you are interested in, what the intervention program or service is that you want to know about, the comparison group, if any, and outlining the specific outcomes you are looking for. So sometimes we have a particular setting in mind as well, which we can also state here. So for example, a school or community setting. The value of a PICO question is that when you have an issue that arises, you can use PICO to turn this into a searchable question, which allows you to further articulate specific components of the question and can then help you to search for relevant information related to your PICO more easily and efficiently. So moving on to our last polling question before we get started with our presentation today, we're interested in learning how often you might use research evidence from systematic reviews to inform your own work. So this can be always, sometimes, or never, or you might not really be familiar with what a systematic review is. So thank you for the responses that are coming in. And just a reminder that you do need to select submit after you've selected your response. Wonderful. So it seems that everybody uses systematic reviews at least sometimes in their own work. So that's really great to see. So I will move on to introducing our presenters and authors today. We're really excited to have Dr. Lamis Jomaa, Lara Kahale, and Dr. Adair P today to present the findings from their recent review. Lamis will be taking the lead during the presentation with support from her colleagues who will be available after the presentation to help answer any questions that you may have. Dr. Lamis Jomaa is an assistant professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Sciences at the American University of Beirut and affiliate assistant professor at the Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Adair Rahman is the Assistant Director of the Medical Laboratory Science Program and the Coordinator of the Pre-Med Program in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Beirut. And Lara Kahale is a PhD candidate and an American University of Beirut Grade Center Coordinator in the Clinical Research Institute at the AUB Medical Center in Lebanon. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and I will pass the presentation along to Lamis to get started with the review. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you for everyone who's joining us today. We're very excited to be sharing with you some of the main findings from our systematic review titled The Effectiveness of Behavioral Interventions to Reduce the Intake of Sugar-Sweetened Beverages in Children and Adolescents, a systematic review and meta-analysis. So just quickly, I would like to note that our systematic review was actually registered in Prospero in 2014, and this is the full registration if you're interested in taking a look at it. So a quick introduction, sugar-sweetened beverages, a topic that is quite interesting for many public health professionals, nutritionists and dietitians, as well as policymakers nowadays worldwide. We're here to talk about it and to talk about the interventions and their effectiveness. But what is the definition of SSB? Like many of you probably know, they are defined as soft drinks, carbonated beverages, fruit juices, and sweetened milk. They are considered to be rich sources of energy with poor nutritional value, and they're representing some of the primary sources of added sugar among children and adolescents in the US, as well as growing evidence in other middle and higher and lower income countries as well. So in this figure, you see that almost 2/3 of the US youth are consuming at least one sugar-sweetened beverage on a given day. And if we also look further, we see that the difference is actually statistically different between boys and girls, with boys having a higher consumption compared to girls, yet both are having quite a high consumption. In terms of the consumption of how much does it represent of the total daily intake, this is data from the NHANES between 2011 and 2014, and it shows again that that there is a significantly linear trend by age in terms of the percentage of total daily calories from sugar-sweetened beverage consumption, with the highest intake being shown among the 12 to 19-year-olds. I also want to point out that the WHO guidelines have been recommending that with children as well as adults that we should be limiting the daily intake of added sugars to less than 10% of the total energy intake, and this is one of the strong recommendations, and some of the countries are going even stricter to representing this into less than 5% of the total energy intake. I also like to point out here that the consumption levels do remain quite high across populations worldwide, even though we're not presenting this in this deck of slides, but there are estimates showing, whether from recent studies by Barry Popkin and other researchers, showing that there are growing sugar-sweetened beverage purchases worldwide and also higher consumption. But why are we concerned? Why would we be concerned about that? Well, there's compelling evidence that supports the strong association and almost causal relationship between sugar-sweetened beverage consumption and increased risk of obesity, as well as several non-communicable diseases, whether it's diabetes, metabolic syndrome, or dental caries. And of course, there are so many pathways that have been proposed and examined to see that effect or the impact of sugar-sweetened beverage intake on health. In this figure, we see that in the diagram, there's a multitude of pathways. We start with the ones on the left in terms of higher sugar-sweetened beverage consumption, increasing energy in a liquid form, which could actually lead to overconsumption of this, what we call it, passive caloric overconsumption, and that would only increase energy intake and contribute to weight gain and to obesity. In addition, there are other plausible mechanisms that have been studied, such as the impact on displacing, when you're drinking sugar-sweetened beverages, it's displacing the consumption of more satiating foods, and it's also, when it's decreasing satiety, the humans and children are failing to reduce their energy intake at the subsequent meals due to the consumption of the liquid calories, which can lead to a positive energy balance and weight gain. Also, the high glycemic load that comes with the SSB consumption does lead to a cascade of changes in appetite regulating hormones. It could also lead to an increase in oxidative stress and inflammatory biomarkers, which in turn can lead to an increase in metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and as well as CHD. And of course, the link between sugar and dental caries has also been strongly found in the literature. So there have been so many or numerous public health interventions targeting sugar-sweetened beverage consumption, and they were also aiming at curbing the rising rates of overweight and obesity, which is equally of a problem that is facing the world as well as the higher income countries and North America in particular. And there's also been so many of those public health interventions. They've been looking either at an educational behavioral approach or environmental approaches. And briefly here, when I'm talking about educational behavioral approaches, we're going to discuss this further with the studies included in our review, but these usually represent an interest and a focus on changing the knowledge and the attitude as well as the behavior of the children towards consumption of SSB. These could include didactic lesson plans in the classrooms, activities, and these could be done in different settings, of course. With the environmental interventions, these have also been quite extensively studied, actually, whether it is limiting the SSB consumption or access to and availability of SSB at the school level, or even sugar-sweetened beverage taxes that are now currently a hot topic as well, although we're not going to talk about it much here in this presentation. In 2014, when we started looking at the evidence, we noticed that there were no systematic reviews that were published at the time exploring the effectiveness of the interventions in reducing SSB consumption. However, our study was slightly delayed, and during that time, there was a review that was published by Adair et al. Exploring the impact of the interventions on reducing SSB intake, as well as the changes in BMI among children aged 2 to 18 years old. And it was actually a narrative analysis that showed results were actually promising, yet there's a lot of mixed evidence, and we wanted to further explore our capacity and ability to basically ask the question again, can we see the impact of educational and behavioral interventions on reduction in the intake of SSB and the changes in body weight, as well as other health outcomes, regardless of the setting? So if we were to go here into the methodology, following the PICOS criteria that Kristen was talking about earlier, these represent the inclusion criteria for our studies. So the participants, we were focusing on studies that included children and adolescents aged 4 to 16 years old. The intervention would include at minimum an educational or behavioral intervention, and it could also be education plus other environmental strategies, as long as the minimum is educational or behavioral intervention targeting the reduction of SSB consumption. The comparison would be with no intervention. And the outcomes, the primary outcome was a change in SSB consumption, and the SSB was defined as a decrease in soft drinks, in sweetened juices, or any sweetened drink or milk. In terms of the secondary outcomes, they included reduction in obesity levels, changes in BMI Z-scores based on the age and gender-specific growth charts, as well as other health outcomes such as diabetes mellitus or hypertension. And the study design that we have picked for our review was randomized controlled trials, because we believe that they are the gold standard for establishing causal relationships and providing reliable evidence while minimizing the risks of confounding factors. So what was the search strategy? We had a comprehensive literature search that was conducted between June and September 2014, and then an updated search and screening in September 2016 of 6 databases listed here: Applied Social Sciences Index and Abstracts, Cumulative Index of Nursing and Allied Health Literature, Cochrane Database of Controlled Trials, Embase, Medline, and PsycInfo. We also looked and included in our search strategy other sources like Google Scholar, Web of Science, and we also looked into references from other systematic reviews and studies that were included in our current review that we were able to retrieve references that are relevant for us. So here we're talking about the data collection and analysis process. So starting from the screening of the titles and abstract that was done by the 2 authors, myself and Adair P, who is actually with me in the room as well. And any article judged to be potentially eligible by at least one of us was retrieved for the full text review. The full text article was further screened independently by both of us for eligibility. And if it was found to be eligible, we actually followed the Cochrane guidelines in terms of the data abstraction, using also Cochrane tools in order to look at the different PICO criteria that we were interested in. If there were any disagreements between both of us, we resolved them through discussion or by consulting a third author. At the time, it was Pauline Adair. The next step was, after that data abstraction, was the meta-analysis using the Review Manager software, and this was conducted primarily by Lara Kahale, who's also with me in the room, and she's going to be also here ready for any questions regarding that particular aspect of our study. In addition, we looked at the risk of bias for each of the included studies, and this was done through the Cochrane Risk of Bias tool. Two authors independently assessed the methodological quality of each of the included studies. And again, any disagreements were resolved in case either by discussion, or if there were persistent discrepancies, we also resolved them with a discussion with the third author. The risk of bias was assessed according to several criteria. Just briefly, I'm going to mention them here, but we are going to be talking much more in depth when we present the results. Random sequence generation as a selection bias, performance biases such as the blinding of participants and personnel were some of the indicators and criteria that we're looking at in terms of risk of bias within these included studies. With respect to the heterogeneity between trials, this was assessed by visually inspecting the forest plots and estimating the percentage of heterogeneity using the I-square statistic. And we also conducted subgroup analysis by the setting school versus non-school setting. Here we're talking about the data synthesis, the next slide, and this is we also looked at the mean differences in the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, which were pooled using a random effects model due to the variations in the study designs, as well, actually not the study designs, but in the participants' baseline characteristics, as well as the type of interventions that were being conducted. We also did some conversion and standardization of outcome units to make sure that, for example, for the primary outcome, which was sugar-sweetened beverage consumption, that was all presented in milliliter per day, and the NutriPro software was used for that purpose for conversion. And here's the exciting part, the results. So we are presenting here the flow diagram for the literature search process. Starting from the top, you see here that we were able to identify at first 10,953 records through the 6 databases that we've mentioned earlier, and an additional 854 records were identified through other sources. After removing the duplicates, we had a total of 6,863 papers. And then we looked further into screening them, and we're able to also exclude several, well, 6,790 actually studies. Further into the full text article assessment for eligibility, as I said earlier, we looked into whether they're eligible based on our also PICOS criteria, and we found out that the remaining were a total of 16 studies that were included in the narrative synthesis. The exclusion purposes, as you can see on the right side box, there were several, either because the study design was not of interest, or the population of interest was not there, or that it was not published in English, which was one of the criteria that we actually have set up front. Of the 16 studies that were included in the narrative synthesis in this review, we're able to actually include only 3 in our quantitative synthesis or the meta-analysis. If we want to talk a brief summary of the characteristics of our trials, we had a total of 16 trials, as I said, or studies, and these included about a total of 19,925 participants. 12 were school-based trials and 4 were non-school-based. Of the 12 school-based trials, 8 included only educational interventions, and 4 included educational and environmental components. So I want to pause here for a minute and just to kind of remind us, the educational component, that would include didactic lessons in the classrooms, followed by interactive activities. Some of these studies were based on theories of behavioral change, some weren't. We'll talk about that also as part of the reason why some of the studies could have been more effective. Also, the studies that for the environmental part, so the 4 studies that included the education, they could also include environmental components, such as replacing, for example, if there were no existing water fountains, making sure that there is an establishment of water fountains in the schools, or providing children with water bottles. There could also, some of them included policies at the level of the school to limit the access and availability of sugar-sweetened beverages in the cafeteria. In terms of the non-school based trials, they included 1 educational and 3 that were educational and environmental. And also the duration, the duration of these studies was ranged from 4 months to 36 months. In here, we're looking at the risk of bias. As we mentioned earlier, we were interested in seeing whether there are any kind of red flags or high risks of bias, and we saw that the majority of the studies scored low risk in the domains related to selection bias, to attrition bias, reporting biases. However, slightly less than half of the studies scored low in the domain related to performance bias, and particularly that's one related to the blinding of participants and personnel. And that could be understandable, actually, as in the literature, it's always mentioned that in behavioral interventions, it's really hard to be blinding the participants because they're aware of what intervention is being conducted, and also for the personnel who are involved in being trained on the conducting of the educational, for example, curriculum and all of that. Also, more than a quarter of the included studies scored high risk in the domain related to detection bias, which is the blinding of the outcome assessment, whereas the remaining studies scored low and unclear risk, the remaining within that particular criteria. The next slide here, we are looking at the meta-analysis of change in our primary outcome, which is SSB intake. What we start here on the left side, at the beginning, we look at the individual studies. We have Mucklebauer 2009 and Sekiri 2008, two of which are school-based trials. And Albala is the one also on the bottom, the third study. And the second column, afterwards, you start seeing, and the subsequent columns, you see the mean basically intake of SSB, and then the mean difference in SSB pre and post intervention. And we also see here, if we were to look at the other side, the forest plot, where it visually can show us the results, and the risk of bias is at the extreme right. Looking at the forest plot, you can see that that the results are showing us that the pooling of the mean difference of these studies is 283.54, and the standard deviation is actually quite wide, and it's crossing between the favoring the intervention and favoring the control, which basically showing us that there is null effect when we are looking at the three studies together combined. Another point I want to mention here, and it's important, which is the fact that we noticed a high level of heterogeneity, reaching over 99% at the I-square statistics, which when we actually did subgroup analysis, looking just at the school, the I-square dropped down to 6%. And we did see that the two studies, Mucklebauer and Sekiri, are showing results favoring the effect of these interventions towards reduction of SSB intake. Okay. When we looked at the independent studies or the other studies that were not included in the system and the meta-analysis, they actually showed similar trends to the results presented in the meta-analysis, which was promising. But I do want to point out to something here that also many of those studies were showing positive effects among girls compared to boys. And this is important to mention because we had a small sample to be able to include in the meta-analysis, given that the units of measurements were differing between the studies, so we were limited with the number of studies, but if we had a bigger pool, we may have had an ability to do subgroup analysis by gender, which would have been actually quite interesting and probably in the future is worth looking at. The next slide is also showing us similar evidence, just reinforcing the fact that school-based interventions actually did show a positive effect when we looked at them as independent studies. When we move to the other forest plot that we see here, this is the meta-analysis of change in BMI, which is a secondary outcome. We do notice again that there were three studies that were included: James 2007, Mucklebauer 2009, and Albala 2008. What we see here is that that the effect is actually null, if you may, or it's not favoring neither the intervention or the control, as you can see from the diamond-shaped effect size in the bottom of the forest plot, and you can also see that in terms of the z-scores as well, and the p-value, which was non-significant. There was moderate heterogeneity, about 60% when we were pooling them together. When we actually did subgroup analysis by setting, school versus outside of the school setting, we noticed that that there was no difference in terms of the effect. It was still non-significant. The same thing that we have seen also with the SSB reduction. The reduction in prevalence of overweight and obesity was not consistent. It's similar in the sense that the other studies were supporting the results of our meta-analysis. However, there was lack of consistent evidence from those included studies with regard to the outcome of prevalence of overweight and obesity or reduction in BMI, which further supports the meta-analysis results. So if we were to look at the conclusion from our review, we saw that behavioral school interventions were able to show a modest evidence or effect in terms of reduction of SSB intake. However, there was insufficient evidence to support a positive effect in reduction in the prevalence of overweight and obesity among children and adolescents or BMI scores. Why could school interventions be successful and would work? There are several theories and mechanisms that have been set in the literature and that we've actually explored and dived into in our discussion and our literature review. Basically, we were looking at what could be the reasons schools promote activities that promote healthy behaviors within the classroom and outside of the classroom. Kids spend prolonged periods of time at school, so there's chances for them to actually practice a lot of the behaviors that they are learning in classroom. One thing that I want to point out that the use of behavioral theories is something that we should probably look further into, and this is one of the recommendations that we have set at the end of our study. The studies that were in the school-based setting that were using behavioral theories were more successful in changing the behavior of SSB intake. That was not the case in the non-school-based studies, and this is worth considering further. And also the theories of behavioral change, there is also evidence in terms of some of the theories being more successful than others in changing dietary intake and SSB consumption. Also, some of the studies that we included in our review included parental involvement, and that could be another reason why some of them were successful. And the role modeling from teachers and peers or observational learning is an important element, as well as improvement in the food selection through environmental changes. With respect to the lack of evidence that supports or the reduction in prevalence of overweight and obesity because of these interventions, I think this could be explained by the fact of several factors. One is some of those studies were focused on only a single message, and we know obesity is a much more complex, multifactorial condition and disease that requires an extensive amount of effort to look at several parameters and factors, and not just dietary intake, but also physical activity, and this is important to mention here. The possibility of compensatory behaviors adopted by children was also seen in some of the studies that we looked at. Children who dropped their consumption of SSB, but they also had a high consumption of fruit juice, so they replaced an improvement in SSB intake was kind of canceled by an increase in fruit juice consumption, which is another area of studies that is worth further exploring. We also saw the variations in the study design and sample size and duration, which could also lead to the lack of this consistent effect in terms of the BMI. I also want to point out that recent two other systematic reviews that were published last year exploring the effects of interventions on the reduction of SSB intake among children. There was one done among adolescents 12 to 17 years old and was only focused on school-based interventions by Vizina M. et al. And also the other study that looked at the consumption, the reduction of SSB and consumption, as well as the increase in water intake among children, adolescents, and adults by Vargas Gracias. They both report and support our results in terms of moderate evidence in reducing SSB consumption among children and adolescents. And also it's interesting to point out that Vargas Gracias also found that the home environment interventions had greater effects than school-based interventions, which we saw in that Albala et al. Study, but this is only one study, so we can't really build much evidence on that. Quick synopsis of the strengths of the study. We believe in this rigorous methodology that was adopted and that we have elaborated here and in the paper. We also have looked into single and multi-component interventions and looked at, as I said, educational versus educational and environmental interventions, as well as parental involvement and other factors. And I think this is a strength in terms of the narrative analysis. We also had various characteristics of the studies and the behavioral change techniques that we looked into, which allowed us to have a more comprehensive, if you want, approach to this question and to capture different possible interventions and different types. However, this could also be considered a problem in terms of how much it added variability and heterogeneity in terms of the studies that we were looking into, whether in terms of the setting or the baseline characteristics of the participants and the intervention strategies and the durations and the intensity of those interventions. Also, there was a variability in the scales and the units of measure that limited our ability to include more studies in our meta-analysis and the limitation of not including non-English studies. So moving forward, there are some practical and research implications. We believe that behavioral interventions in schools can be effective, although evidence is still modest. Combining educational and environmental strategies to reduce SSB consumption associated adverse health outcomes is still the recommendation. However, I think we still need a lot of more research to support what's the best recipe for a successful intervention. And this is where we need probably more well-designed long-term prospective cohort studies and RCTs that report on continuous outcomes. And also the use of measures that could be comparable between different studies would allow reviewers to be able to pull these into bigger meta-analyses. Exploring what constructs from the theories of behavioral change can be most effective is again an important issue. We noticed that only one study in our review looked further into the effect of the mediators on the specific constructs within these theories of behavioral change on the behavior of interest, which can provide a lot of insight of what are those specific constructs within those theories that could be most effective. And finally, examining the effect of single strategies versus combined strategy interventions, whether there are some of them that are successful, and the cost effectiveness of these, of course, is another matter that is worth referring to. Our references are here, and we are open to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lamis, for a very comprehensive presentation of your review. And it was really interesting to hear about your findings on both behavioral and health outcomes for reducing SSB consumption. So we really appreciate you sharing this walkthrough with us today. As we wait for some questions to come in, or for folks to start to think about and formulate any questions they might have, I was wondering if Adair or Lara, do you have any general comments on some of the findings or some of the content of the review?
I'm just sorry, Kristen, I missed the last. Did you ask if my co-authors who are with me, if they have any comments on the?
Yes, yeah, just some general comments, perhaps that you might like to add as we wait for people to perhaps formulate some questions that they might be interested in asking.
Thank you. I think Lamis covered it thoroughly, and I have nothing to add. Adair, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you. Also, Lamis did, I think, a great job, and she presented everything. But I think what's interesting about this review is the heterogeneity in outcomes and in reporting results in different units. So maybe it will be for other coming researchers in the field. So try to report maybe a result in the same units. And also, we contacted many authors to include more articles in systematic review because data pre and post was not available. So also it was among the most important challenges that we have faced in doing our meta-analysis. Thank you.
I echo what Adair and Lara said, and I just wanted to say also Lara is also ready to take any questions that are related to statistical analysis, because she has to basically leave us in a few minutes, and she apologizes for that. But in case there are questions regarding that particular aspect, while she's here.
Okay, great, thank you. I don't see anything perhaps specific. Actually, there's just one question coming in right now from Janice, and I guess it's a bit more of a comment as well. So it's not surprising that there were no significant changes in BMI, as that would take time. Is that your interpretation of the results as well?
Yeah, we were actually skeptical whether we will be able to see a significant change in the BMI, particularly in studies that their duration was like, for example, 4 months or within one school year. These were the ones where we did not think that we would see that, and the review basically further validated the results. However, we would have expected some of the, and we actually, the evidence was there. Some of the studies showed a positive effect at 12 months for the interventions that were long, but that effect was not sustained beyond, this is where the question comes of how do we ensure that the gains that you get from those interventions, how can we make sure that they are sustained beyond the time of the intervention? I think this is one of the major challenges that public health professionals face, nutritionists who are working in the school setting or in the community settings, is how to make sure that the positive effect or gains that you get in terms of the short-term gains, can these be sustained beyond?
Yes, yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for sharing your insights there. So I think while people do formulate any additional questions they have, and before moving on, one of the things that I found really interesting and that you mentioned in your presentation in terms of how your research fits into other types of research that is going on in this field. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or could perhaps speculate on what might account for some of the different findings or effects of the home-based interventions versus the school-based interventions.
Mm-hmm. So if I got your question right, Kristen, what you're saying is why would some of the home-based interventions were more successful? What I would say in our study, a lot of those home-based interventions, not only did they include strong involvement of parents, which is by itself we found it to be a factor that could promote improvements in SSB consumption. The other thing that I wanted to highlight about home-based intervention is that they included sometimes the replacement of sugar-sweetened beverages with milk, for example. So some of those studies not only included educational messages to the parents and tips and postcards, but they also included, for example, milk provision. And this is the case of Al-Bala study that showed a strong effect in terms of, yes, they provided alternatives, and those alternatives were healthier alternatives. Also, even the school-based studies that provided healthier alternatives like water and providing water fountains and providing kids with plastic water bottles encouraged children to actually basically replace the sugar-sweetened beverage consumption. That was not across the board, though, I have to say, because sometimes what happened is some of the children ended up dropping the SSB consumption, increasing fruit juice consumption, which is, there's a growing literature on the effect of fruit juice alone on weight gain and on other metabolic diseases. So we don't want to be improving in one beverage, but rather not being able to keep that effect to other beverages of equal sugar content.
Thank you, Lamis, and that's very interesting and very practical advice. So thank you for sharing that with us. I do encourage people to continue to think about and add your questions to the chat box. But before we do wrap up, I would like to spend a bit of time on a few more polling questions and slides that we have for you today. So if I just move to the next slide here, just a quick question. To ask if you found the information that was presented today useful in your own work and your own programs that you're working on. And again, just a quick reminder to please make sure to press the submit button once you've selected your response. So as people are answering, and thank you for participating in these polling questions, I think everybody seems to mostly agree with that statement, so that's really great. And thank you for joining us to learn about this review today. At this point in the presentation, we would like to share a few options for ways that you can interact with health evidence moving forward. These include visiting our website, registering to receive our monthly tailored registry updates and/or our monthly newsletter to stay up to date on new research and upcoming events. Tell your colleagues about healthevidence.org or follow us on Twitter using the @healthevidence handle. And we also encourage your organization to use health evidence to search for review level evidence to help inform program planning and policy decisions. And you can also contact us to suggest future topics for this webinar series or to provide feedback on the series as a whole. So one more polling question before we wrap up. So with these potential actions in mind, we would like to get your thoughts on what your next steps are after learning about the findings from this review level research on behavioral interventions for reducing consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. So do you plan to access the systematic review, access the quality assessment for this review on our health evidence website, consider using the evidence, or tell a colleague about the evidence that you learned about today. So could you please submit, press submit at the end, and I believe actually for this polling question it is select all. So if there is more than one area that applies, feel free to choose more than one response. So thank you for those who are answering, and it does seem that people do have plans to take what they've learned today and put it into action. So that's really great to hear. So moving forward, we would like to also let you know that your feedback is very important to us, and if you have a few minutes to share your thoughts on today's webinar, your comments and suggestions really help us to improve our webinar series, and we would really appreciate if you take some time to give us some feedback. So I will just take a quick look to see if there's any other questions that have popped up while I've been chatting, and it doesn't look like there are any right now. If you do have questions after the presentation, we'd be happy to we'd be happy for you to contact us, and we can relay them to our authors today. And I will say that brings us to the end of our question period. And I would like to take some time to give a very big thank you to our presenters and authors, as well as to our audience today for participating in this webinar and making it a very wonderful session. And one final reminder that the copy of the recording and the PowerPoint presentation will be posted online in the next week or so. So if you'd like to revisit some of what that has been presented today, please feel free to go there in about a week or so. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us again today, and thank you very much, Lamis, Adair, and Lara.
Thank you. Thank you,
Any
Kristen.
final
Thanks,
words
everyone.
that you'd like to share before we sign off?
I want to really thank you. I was actually very happy to discover and explore further the different webinars, and I think this is a very rich source. I appreciate and the whole team appreciates the fact that you have given us the opportunity to share the findings. I really encourage those who have the time to look further into the review. I think there's very much interesting details in the tables regarding the specific outcomes and the results and the educational strategies used by the different reviewers and the different researchers. So I just want to make sure that, at least people, if they're interested in more information, and of course to reach out to us at any point in time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Lamis, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us all today.